Hi there. Look at me. I'm right next to the puppy dog. Oh, I like that. Homo puppy, the reading for week 5, hey? This is my snapshot number 4. And it's been a lot of fun doing these readings and sort of trying to sort of weave a commentary around them. And the challenge, apart from anything else, of course, is to see that there are such, in some respects, such diverse thinkers working on the sociocultural evolutionary story, challenging one another, critiquing one another, sometimes without explicitly doing so, supporting one another. I think that's really interesting. I think it's important, even as first years, to get a sense that this is what the academic and thinking world is all about. And that largely what you're doing is you're starting to develop, through the exposure to contradictions and paradoxes and affirmations of one another's work as well, that you're starting to get an appreciation and the skills to develop an appreciation for this diverse narrative. But it's not a values-free narrative. Essentially, as the Homo puppy reading suggests, and that's Rutger Bregman, we've got quite a negative story of the human species, a story that is all about competition and violence and so on, which often overlooks the more positive readings and potential histories that we could write of our species evolution across time and space. And therefore, of course, how does global citizenship work within such a narrative? So let's have a look at where we're going. So I want to go back to Graeber and Wengrow, last week's reading, okay? Can we read the local and the specific through a big history lens? That's the question I think that we need to be asking ourselves. David Christian gives us energy, complexity, and collective learning. You're probably getting sick of hearing those terms. David Graeber and David Wengrow critique the flattening out, that you could say, theory, what Christian himself calls macro history, though it's not the way I use that term, but it's still, what he's saying is that it's history at the big scale, the macro scale, macro obviously being big. So the question is, what do we make of a reading like that first week's reading, Icons of the Stone Age, which I hope you've all read now. Look at that, I've left out the apostrophes at the end of that. The Icons of the Stone Age should be closed. If you pay attention to that reading, you'll notice that purposes vary. That though it seems, the very first people who dug up these Venuses or uncovered them, this particular gorgeous Venus is from outside a French cave. And it's, it's quite unusual in that this woman is actually holding a horn, a goat's horn, an ibis, some ibex horn, or whatever it might be. The horn can represent the moon, it can represent many things. But was she a cult figure? The early archaeologists felt that there was this cult spread across the Eurasian continent that lasted for 40 or 50,000 years at least. We've got evidence from 65,000 years ago through to 12,000 ago. And then, of course, we get more specific, more detailed depictions of women until, we end up with a patriarchal religious system. That was what they were thinking about. What's clear is that, all these art forms, the Venuses, as well as all the other, interesting and exquisite representations of the animal world, the natural world, and also these mysterious designs and shapes, all examples of abstraction at work. That means the human cognition, presumably in a pre-literate world, telling stories that people would recognize, stories that were passed down generationally and so on. So collective learning is happening there. These Venuses, as they were called, are widely dispersed across the Eurasian continent. definitely at some level signifies the importance of women in the world, the importance of the mother, you might say. From a Graeber and Wengrow perspective, they can see really interesting tensions, because we have variety and we also have continuity. The human urge, I think, is to rush into creating continuity, when in actual fact there are quite, and this article makes it very clear on the Icons of the Stone Age, this article makes it clear that there was considerable variety or diversity between these representations, though they also have striking similarities. They were all very small, except for this one was bigger because it was cut on a rock. But I mean, all the portable Venuses were small. They all seem to, they don't seem to be too focused on identity. The face is not important. Breast, thighs, vulva, those aspects of the female body associated with fertility, with fecundity, with reproduction, are very much in the forefront. The other question is, and this is a question that Graeber and Wengrow asked, I'm pointing around, here it is, the Humankind, the Rutger Bregman book. Particularly, these guys all point to the fact that tendency, it's a natural tendency to impose categories of the present on the past. The actual term Venus is very problematic. Venus is a Western cultural icon. She's obviously a Roman goddess. She has antecedents. Aphrodite was the Greek version, and before that you can go back across into the various female cults of Southwest Asia, Egypt, and so on. But of course, those cults all grew out of a world in which we did have a female matriarchal oriented religion until, definitely until probably the Bronze Age. It shifted very quickly to male dominance. Zeus dominating Hera, Apollo ousting Gaia from from Delphi, where Apollo becomes the primary deity, and Gaia becomes the serving deity at that particular site. We can see these shifts, but very recent in relation to what we're looking at here, these Venuses. So the question that we need to ask is, how can we bring the local and the specific into a big history context? Because most of you, including myself, we're all attracted to history because we have a fascination for the specificities of the past, and I think we have to acknowledge that. But at the same time, there's something liberating about the vision that David Christian provides us. Let's keep moving. So this week's reading from the National Geos was the megaliths. So what can we say? Again, asking that question that, what can we make of the mighty megaliths? From a Graeber and Wengrow perspective, well, megaliths and ag seem to be very much associated with agriculture. There are multiple takes, and I haven't exposed you to these, of megaliths as part of sacred landscapes. Landscapes very similar to the landscapes of Indigenous Australians, First Peoples, with songlines. Lynn Kelly, whom I spoke about last week, from this wonderful book Songlines. She, and that if you watch the video clip that I provided you from the YouTube talk she gave, the TEDx talk, she's saying, look, these landscapes told stories. What's interesting about the landscapes of Western Europe, particularly with their megaliths, is that these stories had both local as well as, you might call them international, wrong word in the sense, of course, importance. These landscapes told stories about for the local community. They anchor the local communities in a place, in a space. They provided them with history. This is the West Kennet Long Barrow, which I visited nearly 40 years ago now. Very impressive place. Had a burial of at least 30 to up to 60, 80 individuals. Obviously from a community. Building these structures, Stonehenge, think of Easter Island, think of any, I mean, you could even think of the pyramids, which I'll bring up in a little while, you know, takes a lot of coordination. It takes a large commitment of large numbers of people over time. It takes a vision also, which raises the question of social order and hierarchy, the kinds of questions that Graeber and Wengrow were asking in our last week's reading, you know, about, well, what can we say about the princely burials? Well, I mean, even just saying the word princely suggests that you've got one order that's above the order, either in terms of affluence, in terms of power, and so on. But, you know, Stonehenge, which evolved over, you know, thousands of years, particularly, but it, you know, very much came into focus over a, you know, a period of 400 or 500 years as part of a much broader sacred landscape. There's a YouTube clip from Wessex Archaeology, which I've made available on the extra readings area, if you're interested in this, where they talk about those sacred landscapes very explicitly, how they all interrelate. These mighty megaliths are something that we could, or you could, study in detail as a career, as an archaeologist or an archaeohistorian or an archaeobiologist, botanist, whatever it might be, where you might choose to take it. So, you know, the Graeber and Wengrow, the need for specificity comes into play. But at the same time, we can see that these sacred landscapes that filled with megaliths and so on still fit parts of the kind of narrative that energy, complexity, and collective learning are all telling. The energy required, complexity in terms of community beliefs and communal organization, collective knowledge, collective learning over generations passing down, the way, as Lynn Kelly might say, you know, these and similar structures all over the planet are all important pre-literate oral memory clocks or memory palaces, you might call. I really like that idea. I think in week 3, we encountered what I call Gilgamesh. This is Assyrian tablet from the library of Ashurbanipal, okay, and you know, which is relatively late. The Gilgamesh story was already at least 2,000 years old by the time it was written down here, and this is the particular one where, that's right, where Utnapishtim is there. You can see there in the 3rd dot point. Noah, before he became Noah, I'm sure that they chose Noah because it's much easier to say than Utnapishtim is, at least for us. Or is it just familiarity that makes Noah easier to say? I'll leave you to think about that one. But, you know, what can we then do with the Graeber and Wengrow perspective on Gilgamesh? And also, how would David Christian read it? Clear example of social hierarchy, because of course Gilgamesh is a god king. There are qualities of the epic and also of the hero emerging. Why? Because this is after the period, long after the period of the so-called Venuses, for instance, and the megaliths. There's influenced by dissemination. The Gilgamesh stories fed into a number of traditions and of course had informed the biblical stories as well, particularly the story of the Great Flood and Noah. So we have not just social theory, which of course I gave you that quote last week where David Graeber and David Wengrow were saying, well, it's kind of a make-believe, you know, we make up a theory and then we apply it and it helps us see something. But then we say that it is just make-believe or a theory, and we then, what do? Well, we start applying it to everything. We start living within that paradigm, okay? So not just social theory that diminishes the individual, I would suggest that the epic can do so as well. Their focus on Gilgamesh means that we are forgetting about the thousands and thousands of human beings that were living in the world of Uruk, in the world of Mesopotamia, over generations. How specific do we need to get? How specific can history get? I think we can tell reasonably accurate kinds of stories about life of a village peasant in Mesopotamia. I think we've got enough archaeological and archaeobiological and so on evidence to look at their diet, their routines, look at how they adapted and shaped the environment. I think there's a lot. All right. One of the important things now, thinking of the week two reading with Harari's Sapiens book, that we have imagined orders here. One of the things about Gilgamesh is that it's a codification of an oral tradition that came long before it was ever written down with cuneiform and so on. So we have an imagined order presented here, an order of right relationships between categories of peoples, and also between Gilgamesh and Enkidu, who is sort of nature in a sense, that becomes human, and he sacrifices himself for Gilgamesh in a way. Models of friendship, models of loyalty, the emergence of the city. The Uruk was the city that Gilgamesh, almost founded. He was of that city according to the. Let's keep moving. Now, Çatalhöyük, is an amazing place. Discovered in the 1920s by James Mallet. It was a tell which is a large hill in Turkey. Quite close to Göbekli Tepe, another tell. What do we learn, or can we learn from Çatalhöyük? Noting that there's only about 5% of Çatalhöyük has so far been excavated. Çatalhöyük has no city, no streets. These buildings, this is an artist's impression of them, they don't have doors. There's evidence that, these spaces were for living in, habitation, but also for ritual and so on. There's a community here. Up to 8,000 people lived in Çatalhöyük, 8,000 to 6,000 BCE or wherever it was, somewhere around then. And of course, this is the reading for you as well. We have community, we have order, we have clear examples of religion and agriculture. There are ritual spaces in nearly all houses. There's no major center. Well, not that they've found so far. Admittedly, I've told you they've only done 5%, excavated 5%, because, of course, every year or two there are improvements to archaeological practice. There's clear evidence of some level of domestication, but also ongoing hunter-gathering, hunting of wild animals, as well as there were sheep and goats domesticated, according to what the archaeologists think, looking at the remains there. Obviously, there was an imagined order of some kind. This was a relational space. You can't get 1,000 people living together if they're all hyper individuals or just small clans. But it appears, so they're thinking at least with this space, that each home unit was a clan unit. And that clan units came together or coalesced, you could say, in a space like this. And of course, there is evidence of trade and movement of peoples around. One of the things to note about Çatalhöyük and the megaliths, the Venuses, and even Gilgamesh, is that people weren't as sedentary as necessarily they were made out to be. No doubt lots of the peasants lived generation after generation working the land. But, peasantry is a late Neolithic innovation. Most of these people were on the move, which is quite amazing. People were moving often hundreds, if not thousands of kilometers to different places. And that's really interesting to note. I'm just thinking of the Ötzi man, the remains of that guy they found up in the ice and snow, I think in the 1990s. who had been murdered by some people. They'd shot him in the back with an arrow. But after obviously there had been a confrontation because he had half-healed knife wounds on his hand and so on. But this guy had been living in the valleys of northern Italy. They've assessed his pollen. They've done a bunch of stuff because his body was so well preserved. But this guy was on the move. Similarly, there was a body dug up near Stonehenge. The arrow, what's it called? The arrow. He was an archer. The something or other archer. There's what the archaeologists have called him, buried with massive amounts of gold, weaponry, arrows, knives, bronze, flint, tools as well. So he was in between. He was in that cusp between, so that he was still using Neolithic stone tools, cutting-edge stone tools, with bronze tools. Okay, there was a lot of gold. He had an anvil with him and a whole range of things, small anvil, little one, just for silversmithing and working metals. So, I mean, this guy had, because they took his some DNA from his teeth. He had actually come all the way to England from mainland Europe. He'd grown up and been, lived his early life in near Switzerland. So there's evidence for webs on the go here as well. I think that's really, really interesting. The stories we can surmise, half tell. Okay, we've got to be so careful that we don't go beyond the evidence. We don't make up reasons for things. So that tentative language that's used so beautifully by Graeber and Wengrow is something I think we need to follow. So what do we think then about those webs and sociality? Look at this. This is one of those silver foxes, which is one of the chief Homo puppy elements of the Homo puppy chapter from Bregman. Okay, sociality is linked to collective learning and imagined orders. Okay, so that's every Christian and Yuval Harari. It's facilitated through webs, of course. People's ideas and materials are moving. That's McNeil's, and a variety plus similarity. Those interesting tensions that are David Graeber and Wengrow point to. Bregman gives us the example of friendliness. He takes sociality, collective learning, and pushes it into this thing. If you want a clever fox, he argues, you don't select for cleverness, you select for friendliness. That's a really interesting assertion. And it's an interesting development because what he's doing is he's taking collective learning, that really abstract idea from David Christian, and he's actually giving it a biophysical representation, and he's trying to demonstrate it through a series of experiments and research done over the last century or so. So this is taken from that reading. The true human superpower. Okay, you get a kid, you get a orangutan, and you get a chimpanzee, and you put them through various tests. Spatially, and ability to calculate and causality, that they all do reasonably evenly on. But not so social learning. Human infants do much, much better in that realm of social learning, as he demonstrates. Okay, that's important. Why? Because something has occurred developmentally, evolutionarily, however you want to describe it, in the way our species functions. Can we say that chimps and orangutans were more aligned with Neanderthals, and therefore, human beings were able to eclipse them or absorb them or annihilate them? That's something that we can't say for sure yet, except there's evidence, of course, of interbreeding between humans and Neanderthals and Denisovans and the other early hominids. I left this slide totally naked because I want you to think about it. Dmitry Belyaev, he's the guy who bred all the silver foxes. Theory was that people are domesticated apes. Who was saying that about domestication? Think about it. Think about it. Okay, who was talking about domestication? Okay, that for tens of thousands of years, the nicest humans had the most kids. That the evolution, in other words, they weren't so selfish, that the evolution of our species, in short, was predicated on survival, on not of the fittest, but of the friendliest. I love that idea. I think it's a really powerful concept. And yeah, we'll keep working with it, won't we? So let's have a look then. So this is continuing with Bregman stuff. He goes on to say, human beings, it turns out, are ultra-social learning machines. Again, he's echoing the David Christian line without, necessarily even having read a word of Christian's work. We're born to learn, to bond, and to play. Maybe it is not so strange, he goes on then, that blushing is the only human expression that's uniquely human. Blushing, after all, is a quintessentially social thing. It's people showing that they care of what others think, which fosters trust and enables cooperation. Trust, cooperation. Think about the amount of energy, social complexity, and collective learning, as me pick up of the David Christian stuff, that it took to build pyramids like these guys here, or set up the megaliths from, the earlier slide. Huge amounts of human energy over long periods of time to create these edifices, and a lot of social organization, the cooperation. So do we have a Bregman versus Graben-Wengrow sort of situation? Can we somehow align them, bring them into, maybe it's a question of scale, maybe all of what we're doing, and I feel for this, or I feel into this space, that I don't think these guys are all at one another's throats. They can be critical of one another, but I think they're describing different phenomena, different things. Are we or they looking at different things? So staying with Bregman, our distant ancestors knew the importance of the collective and rarely idolized individuals. Graben-Wengrow might take him to task on that. Hunter-gatherers the world over, okay, he's generalizing, from the coldest tundra to the hottest deserts, believe that everything is connected. Songlines type stuff again. They saw themselves as part of something much bigger, linked to all other animals, plants, and Mother Earth. Perhaps they understood the human condition better than we do today, they suggest. So maybe they did. And so those Venuses again, this is a stylized Western Venus. Doesn't look much like the old Venuses in that magazine. Where is it? Yeah, it doesn't look much like that. Okay. Icons of the Stone Age. But I wanted to show you this one because there's so much in terms of energy, complexity, and collective learning that could be said about, let's say, this period of European history, Western history, the Italian Renaissance. I'm hoping that many of you are familiar with this image, but if not, tattoo it into your brain, because it's an iconic image. It's a painting by Sandro Botticelli. Botticelli, a very interesting man in himself, in a regard. I'm just trying to get that to go away. Yeah, there. Thank God for that. So back to those Venuses again. The Italian Renaissance was a period of, you could say, new learning for the West. They were indebted to much of the Islamic researchers and also to the alive, kept books alive, Aristotle and so on. But they also were indebted to materials that started to flow around the Mediterranean again, pigments for the paints and so on. But also, that there was a new historical consciousness. The Italian Renaissance people started to think of themselves as in a new era, in a period where new learning was emerging, and that new learning was old learning rethought. In other words, the learning, the ability to sculpt like the ancient Greeks and Romans had sculpted, had emerged again. The ability to build incredible structures, architectural structures. For the first time, they had the engineering skills and understanding and knowledge to do so again. That's why it's called a renaissance, the rebirth. It's like going back to the best of the past and bringing it into the future. They were still consciously aware of themselves as historical beings, which is possibly the first time that we have that historical self-awareness coming into the planet in the form it took in the West. So I just wanted to revisit that and sort of demonstrate again how this idea of the Venus is a very deep cultural iconic. That's why this reading is called Icons of the Stone Age. An icon is a figure that represents a swag of deep beliefs and culture. It's an object, usually in the Christian sense, icons in churches, of adoration and worship. It is symbolic of a metaphysical world out there. Certainly that's true of an image like this too. So what can we say then, so this is the concluding slide, about global citizenship? It's easy to be and think of a global citizen, as a global citizen, should I say, if we have a positive vision. That's why in all the conversations I say, well, what's something that gives you hope? Okay, what are you seeing out there that gives you hope? Clearly, people are not always nice. I mean, we can't expect that. And we have millennia of enculturation in separation. The tribe, the species, race, the city, economics, religion, all provide identity anchors, but they also create friction or tension. What would David Christian call that? He would call it complexity, right? Do we collectively learn all the time? Complexity can lead to horror. Just think Nazis or any white supremacists. So it leads to horror as we fight to retain a stable sense of identity. In other words, people will go out and kill to keep their world in order. One example is the Tulsa Race Massacre of 1921. That was a period sort of 50, 60 years after the American Civil War. Black people had been given the vote and emancipated. The south of the US was still largely an agricultural world, but there was, like in Oklahoma, that's where Tulsa is. There was a growing affluent African American community. The whites, 30th or 31st of May or whatever it is to the 1st of June, went on a berserk sort of massacre campaign, killed about 300 African American people, burnt down 1,250 something homes, and totally wiped out this major center in the town of Tulsa. They're now digging up, finding the mass graves and so on. But that's an example of the horror. And this is a photograph of it here, that when we fail to manage complexity and we fall back into tribal, or in this case, racist beliefs and so on, anger, violence, panic, despair, all bubble up. And we end up with, horrific examples of human beings not being nice to one another. So you can counterpose that. This is sort of like my final thought with the work of historians like Rutger Bregman, who provide many examples of human beings being friendly, to use his term. It's the survival of the friendliest. Friendliness links to intelligence, links to cleverness, links to the ability to manage social situations. It links to the ability to also manage, of course, handle and cope with, maybe even flourish with complexity. I'll leave you there for that one, and we'll catch up again next week. Thank you.